it's not really a comparison. I had been recently giving some shiurim on the Piazetzner Rebbe, who was the last Hasidic Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto. And part of what you see from those stories is that even in the middle of the Holocaust, even when it was a tremendous sakana, people continued to learn, people continued to have minyanim. So in some ways, this idea of closing the shul, I mean, this didn't even occur during the Holocaust itself. And the emes is, although we obviously have to be very, very concerned for health, and Chazal say, Chamira sakanta mi'isura, that in yanim of sakana, one has to be stricter than, of course, even in matters of kashrus or the like. But, one also has to have a little bit of common sense. Baruch Hashem, this is not the bubonic plague. This is not the Black Death. If, God forbid, and it shouldn't happen, a regular person gets corona, it is not very different than the flu. When people are at a higher risk situation, then of course it's dangerous. But tens of thousands of people die every year from influenza. So influenza is a sakana, and this is a sakana. But this is not a sakana that's qualitatively different fundamentally than influenza. And people point out that this must be a mighty smart virus if you can count the difference between 10 people and 11 people. Somehow when there's 11 people, it's going to attack. 10 people is not going to attack. The viruses are not that smart. Okay. Anyway, I wanted to share with you something maybe you did see. It's actually very, very interesting. And that is, we actually have a letter from Rabbi Akiva Eiger, the great Rabbi Akiva Eiger, who dealt with a cholera epidemic back in 1837. And all of us know Rabbi Akiva Eiger, of course. He was one of the great Gainim of all time, tremendous amkus in his learning, in his mastery of Kol HaTorah Kula. But in fact, he also had a very, very heroic role in a cholera epidemic that was really killing hundreds of thousands, not just of Jews, hundreds of thousands of people generally. And in fact, because of his very valiant efforts in both public health and in helping the people who were sick, he was actually given an award by the King of Prussia, Frederick William III of Prussia, who actually gave Rabbi Akiva Eiger a medal because of his heroic efforts. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was the Rav of Posen. Posen eventually became part of Poland, but in Rabbi Akiva Eiger's time, it was Prussia, really part of Germany. So that's actually very interesting, because normally the Litvish like to claim Rabbi Akiva Eiger as a Litvak. In fact, Rabbi Akiva Eiger was a German. He was a Yeki. He was not a Polish or Lithuanian Gadol. And B'kitzur, let me just read you what it says here. Again, this is a letter. This is not in the Tshuvas Rabbi Akiva Eiger, but these are letters that he wrote. And this was a letter that he wrote to Rabbi Leo Gutmacher. Now, Rabbi Leo Gutmacher himself was quite a famous person. He was one of the Gedolei Hador. He was very great in Kabbalah as well. He was a tzaddik that many people came to for brachos. So it's interesting that he B'dafka asked Rabbi Akiva Eiger for advice how to deal with this epidemic of cholera. And of course, in Yiddish, cholera, if you write it out, it's choli ra, an evil illness, choli ra. But cholera is also the name of the illness itself. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes, he writes to his dear friend, Rabbi Leo Gutmacher, and he makes the point, it is emes, be'inyan tefillah bebeis haknesses, with respect to davening in shul, lidati, according to my view, ze emes, sha'akibutz b'makom tsar eino nachon. It is not good to assemble people in a crowded area. Aval efsher lispalel kitos. So in the Beis HaKnesses, people should daven in small groups, right, one after the other. Pam b'msei ma'at, and each time only a small number. Erech tesvav anashim, approximately 15 people. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger does not put it, he's not as strict as the Misrat HaBriyut. He says 15 people is good. V'yaschilu bi'or haboker, it should be like a minion factory. They should start at the crack of dawn. V'achareha katacheres, and right afterwards, another group comes in. And each person decides when he wants to come. It should be this way for mincha as well. And after each prayer, both in the morning and in the evening, there should be tehillim. And then he talks about these parts of the slichos, El Rachum Shemecha, that Hashem's name is mercy. And then Mishana, Hashem who answered Avram, should answer us, etc. And then he mentions you should also pray for the king. Okay, that's there. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger makes the point, and this is something to think about, that one should recite the Parsha of Ketoris, because we do know from Chazal that the incense was a kayach, a spiritual kayach, that protected us from magefa, from plague. The Torah itself says this. When there was a plague after Korach, Aaron brought Ketoris, Vateyotzar hamagefa. The magefa went away. Bisman hazeh, we don't have the korban of Ketoris. Our own personal incense is not going to do it. But when we say Ketoris, so that gives us a certain school. And now it's interesting that the minhag of Eretz Yisrael, as you know, is we do say Pitum HaKtoris every single day at the end of Shachris. And many people say it before Mincha as well. In Chutz La'aretz, most Ashkenazim do not say it every day. And it's actually interesting why. In other words, most Ashkenazim only say Pitum HaKtoris on Shabbos after Musaf. Now the Ramah brings a reason for that, and it's a bit of a strange reason. By the Ketoris, it says, when you make the Ketoris out of its 11 ingredients, if you leave out an ingredient, you're chayav misa. Now that's referring to making the Ketoris. If I make the Ketoris with 10 ingredients instead of 11, I'm chayav misa. So the Ramah brings a view that during the week when I'm in a rush, I might skip an ingredient. I might forget to read an ingredient, and then I would be chayav misa for being machaser the Ketoris. Therefore, some people had a minhag not to say Ketoris during the week, only on Shabbos, when people have more time, and they're more relaxed, and they're less likely to skip. Now this is a very, very shver svara, because although it's true, this is kind of taking the idea that when you say it, it's as if you did it. It's making it super literal. It's saying, oh, if I only said it with 10 ingredients, it's as if I made it with 10 ingredients, I'm chayav misa. But normally it doesn't work that way. It only works that way for your benefit. It doesn't work that way for your detriment. It's similar to a ha'ara the Levush makes. Right? The halacha is, let's say you're davening Shemona Esrei, and the chazan is now going to say Kedusha. So what do you do if you're in the middle of Shemona Esrei and the chazan is up to Kedusha? So the halacha is you stop and you don't answer, but you have kavanah that when the chazan says the words, you're being yotzei with those words through the principle that is called shomeya ka'ona. Right? When you hear someone doing a mitzvah for you, it's as if you said it. So the Levush asks the kasha, it's really from the Rishonim already, well, mima nefshach, if I'm not allowed to interrupt my Shemona Esrei, but by listening to the chazan saying it, it's as if I said it. So if it's as if I said it, have I not been mafsik in Shemona Esrei? So how can I be mechaven to be yotzei via shemeya ka'ina? If shemeya ka'ina, right, literally, shomeya, when I listen, it is as if I said it, I'm mafsik in Shemona Esrei. So the Levush's answer is like this. Levush's answer is, it's a split. Since we have a klal, machshava tova, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitztaref l'maisa. A good thought, a thought to do a good deed, Hashem considers it as if you did it. But a thought to do an aveira is not called an aveira till you do it, right? This is the klal. A machshava tova, HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'maisa. A machshava ra, ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaref l'maisa. So Mamela, the Levush says the following: when I am mechavein to be Yaitse Kedusha through the Chazan, because I'm in the middle of Shemona Esrei, so Lagabe the Taiva, in other words, to be Yaitse Kedusha, Hashem considers my machshava to be a Maisa. But Lagabe the Ra'ah, I'm not allowed to be mafsik during Shemona Esrei. Hashem doesn't consider. Now, this is a chiddush because this is the same thing. This is not like a machshava for an aveira versus a machshava for a mitzvah. Here, you're taking the very same phenomenon. I am mechavein to be yaitse the words of kedusha. So says the Levush, legabe the positive thing, your machshava is a maisa, so your yaitse kedusha. Legabe the negative thing, your machshava is not a maisa, so it's not a hefsek. That's the Levush. And Lamaisa, whether you like that lumdus or not, that is the halacha, of course, that I listen and I'm mechaven to be yaitse, and that is not called a hefsek in Shemona Esrei. This is before you've said Hamavarech Esamo Yisrael Bashalom. Now, by Ketores, most poskim say the same thing. The idea that when you say the parsha of Ketores, it's as if you brought the Ketores, is only going to work to give you the zechus of bringing the Ketores. We're not going to say, oh, if you missed an ingredient, it's like you brought the Ketores and you missed an ingredient and you're chayav misa. Nevertheless, the Ramah does bring that the basis of the minhag Ashkenaz in Chutz La'aretz, not to say Pitum HaKetores during the week, is because im chiser mikol siman, and that's why it's also brought down that one should also say it from a siddur. Now, in Eretz Yisrael, so Rabbi Akiva Eiger says here, though, Rabbi Akiva Eiger makes the point here, that if you didn't say Ketores every day, during a time of Magefa, you should say it. He instructs the Minyanim to say Ketores every day at the end of davening, based on the idea that Ketores is Otzer, it holds back the spread of a Magefa. Now, Baruch Hashem, in Eretz Yisrael, since the minhag of Eretz Yisrael is that we say it anyway, so this bit of advice is already followed. Although Rabbi Akiva Eiger adds it should also be said at Mincha, so that might be something to think about possibly. Yeah.
Based on the svara that we don't say this during the week because of possibly forgetting one, why would that svara apply in Chutz La'aretz and not in Eretz Yisrael? Are we not in as much of a rush in Eretz Yisrael?
No. The answer is yes. I mean, the answer is that if you were to say that svara, that would apply here as well. The only thing was that svara was not accepted here. In other words, it's not that anyone made a chiluk between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz with respect to forgetfulness, but rather that svara b'chlal was not makubal. Yeah.
Does it make any difference if you say Pitum HaKetores in Korbanos?
Yeah. So again, there's a Pitum HaKetores in Korbanos that's actually longer. It's a more complete statement. That would be good too. Now he mentions at the end of davening, but I don't think there was a hakpada b'dafka. The Pitum HaKetores there would be fine as well. Right. So that's what he says. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger does indicate that there ought to be separate minyanim. A minyan should not be more than 15 people at a time, and at the end of the minyan they should say Tehillim, certain passages from Selichos, and Pitum HaKetores. And then, just a second here. Now he's a little tough. He says one has to be very careful that no more than 15 people should be allowed to be there. And he even writes to Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, if it's necessary to get the police to guard the shul, to prevent extra people from going there, he says it is proper to do so. And he even mentions, you can use my name. Apparently Rabbi Akiva Eiger had a good in with the authorities, so he told Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, tell them that this is what I said, and the police will certainly obey your instructions. Again, this is so fascinating. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was known as a meshunadika anaf, an extremely, extremely humble person, in spite of his great ga'inus. So I think you see over here that even a humble person needs to use his authority when it's necessary to help Klal Yisrael. That he's kind of saying, I'm well known by the authorities, use my name, and you'll get the police. Otherwise, the police might not care what happens to the Jews, right? That's what he's saying. They would say, let the Jews die. What's the difference? Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, though, but tell the police that this is what I said, and they will certainly listen to you. Okay, and then he mentions about giving tzedakah, and every family should give tzedakah, and he says even for newborn babies and for pregnant women, they should give tzedakah both for themselves and for the child that they are carrying. That, of course, is known because tzedakah tatzal mimaves, the giving of charity, is matzil from the gezeirus of death. And then Rabbi Akiva Eiger gives health instructions. He says it's important not to get over chilled. It's important to wear proper clothing in the cold climate. This is during the winter. Not to eat bad foods. And he especially mentions pickles. I'm not sure exactly if this corresponds to anything medically that we know today, but he does mention that. He says, do not eat a lot of fruit. Do not eat a lot of fish. Do not drink a lot of beer. Better to have a lot of small meals. Eat frequently, smaller amounts. That is a general health advice, as opposed to eating very, very big meals. Change clothing. Keep your clothing clean. Do not worry. Do not be overly anxious. One should try to avoid sadness or depression. One should not go outside during the night, but during the day when the sun is at its height, when the air is warmer, then it is proper to take a walk in the warm air because the virus is less virulent in the heat. In fact, this is what they say. They say when the weather will get hotter, the coronavirus will be less potent. He says, keep the windows open. Use a lot of vinegar as a disinfectant. Clean surfaces with vinegar mixed with rose water. And he also mentions chewing on the bark of an oak tree. I'm not sure exactly what that mentions, but he mentions Rinde from Eichenholz, which I didn't know what it was, but I looked it up. Rinde min Eichenholz, he uses the German or the Yiddish, means the bark of an oak tree. And he says that's what's going to be good. He talks about hygiene, washing frequently, changing clothes frequently, using vinegar, and Be'ezras Hashem HaKadosh Baruch Hu will bring a refuah to Am Yisrael. So you have to understand that this is fairly advanced medically from that time. This goes back to the 1830s, when the spread of infectious disease was not very clearly understood. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger was involved in this. So you see that even a guy who is totally shakua in Torah was very, very involved in being concerned for health. Now we know that during this cholera epidemic, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, this was towards the end of his life. He was already the Gadol Hador. But there was a young man in Vilna who was just starting off, and that was Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter also lived through this very same cholera epidemic, and we have a very, very famous story that he was a young man. He was in his 20s, early 20s, and on Yom Kippur, he put up a sign before Yom Kippur that everybody should eat on Yom Kippur because if their resistance is weak, they are amenable to this illness, and they could die. It was pikuach nefesh. Now, the Rabbanim of Vilna did not like that. They didn't want to give a hedge. I mean, no, if someone has a special health condition, we'll matter them to eat. But to simply say everybody should eat on Yom Kippur because there's a cholera epidemic, they were not willing to issue such a psak. They said, we're not going to just say everybody can eat. So the story goes, in the middle of Yom Kippur services, in the main shul of Vilna, the biggest shul of Vilna, he got up, he made kiddush, and he ate a piece of cake in front of the assembly in the main Beis Knesset of Vilna in order to make the point that this is a matter of pikuach nefesh. Now you can understand that this created an uproar. I mean, the senior Rabbanim wanted to put him in cherem. They wanted to kick him out of town. And nevertheless, he made the point that it was pikuach nefesh. Now, there's an interesting little question about that story. If chas v'shalom, a person has to eat on Yom Kippur, and sometimes you have to, do you make kiddush on Yom Kippur? So the halacha actually is you don't. Now, when you bench, or you say ala michya, there actually is an insert for Yom Kippur. But you don't make kiddush. And in a sense, it almost doesn't make sense to make kiddush, because if I need to eat meat or something, why should I drink something extra for kiddush? So the question is, if aliba d'emes, you don't make kiddush on Yom Kippur, why did he make kiddush? That's a kash on that ma'aseh. Even if he held it was pikuach nefesh, and you have to eat, you don't make kiddush. So why did he make kiddush? So my interpretation is, even though you don't make kiddush, people think you're supposed to make kiddush because it's a Yom Tov. So if he wouldn't have made kiddush, even though he would be right, people would think he didn't know the halacha and they wouldn't listen to him. So he had to do something that was incorrect because people assume it was correct, because that would give his psak credibility. It's a very mudna, it's kind of a reverse psychology. If he would have done the right thing, they would have thought it was the wrong thing. And if it would be the wrong thing, they wouldn't have paid attention to him. So he had to do the wrong thing that people think is the right thing. And that way, people paid attention to his psak. But what's interesting is there's another side of the story in which he personally was involved with taking care of people who got the illness. And he was Magayas. He drafted many yeshiva bachrim and young avrechem to work with him, even though they were exposing themselves to the danger of possibly getting the illness. But he made a promise to each person that if you work with me to help these cholim, no one will get the illness. Hashem will protect you with that merit. So, and Baruch Hashem, kachave, that none of the people that were working with him did get ill. But it's amazing that in spite of the fact that he was so makel on the laws of pikuach nefesh, that he said to eat on Yom Kippur, even if you weren't sick, that he was willing, he was so batuach in the shem shamayim of taking care of chaylim, that he said there will not be a sakana. He paskined there would not be a sakana for this. Right. So these are two gedolim, one towards the end of his life, the great Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and one towards the beginning of his career, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, both of whom were Meiser Nefesh for Klal Yisrael that was suffering a tremendous magef. And now again, the cholera epidemic was actually a more dangerous epidemic than the coronavirus, but nevertheless, everything that comes into the world, I mean, part of the great musar of the coronavirus is not just the sickness itself, but the panic, which is almost an unprecedented panic. The word pandemic. Pandemic is it's not an uncommon word. I mean, every 2 years there is what is called a pandemic, which is a worldwide epidemic. Last year there was Zika, and before that there was SARS, severe acute respiratory something, and before that there was swine flu. And they tend to come from China. China is like the Avi Avos Hatuma of all of these different things. In the 1918, there was a worldwide influenza epidemic, the Spanish flu, it was called, that killed, I think, 20 million people. 20 million people worldwide, mamish, a real epidemic. So pandemics happen, but the panic here is very, very unusual. In other words, if one were to talk about the real sakana is there may be a worldwide depression and an economic collapse because of the fear that people have. That's the real. I mean, no, not that he's a great friend of the Jews, but FDR said it best. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and that has a lot of resonance. The fear of the machala, it'll be more destructive than the machala itself. But what is the ultimate lesson? The ultimate lesson is, and I said this before already, but it's worthwhile to think about this, is that, modern man thinks we're in control of everything. There's so many things we control. We are masters of technology, masters of medical science. We control the economy. We control health and death and birth. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu reminds us in very vivid ways how little we control things. That things can happen that can change things at the turn of a dime. Right? We have all sorts of medicines. HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows us a machala, which at least for the time being, we don't yet have any type of medicine or any type of vaccine. And, the fact that a virus is so tiny, it's reminiscent of the story of Titus. Titus was the Roman emperor who destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. And he believed, he took his sword and he pierced the paroches of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And it started bleeding. So Titus, in his delusions of grandeur, said, I killed God. And when he's taking his boat, his ship back to Rome, that's filled with the spoils of the Beis HaMikdash, there's a big storm, and the boat is going to sink. And Titus raises his fist to Hashem, and he says, you're a big shot on the water. You drown Paro in the water, you destroy the world with a flood. Wait till I get to dry land and then fight me there. And the HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Titus, said about Titus, you think I have to fight you? I'll get a little insect that'll defeat you totally. I don't need to fight. You don't need me to fight you. The smallest of my creatures can totally destroy you. And the Gemara goes on and says that an insect or a parasite entered Titus's nose and eventually grew and grew and grew and kind of a tumor or whatever it would be, and it destroyed his brain from the inside. So a virus measures like 1/1000th of a micron. Tiny, tiny, microscopic, certainly not visible to the naked eye. HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't have to demonstrate his power by, doing something, God himself has to come down and reveal himself. He can take this tiniest little thing, and that wreaks havoc and confusion and panic and fear throughout the entire world. So the great lesson is that we're not in control. Now, people talk about the idea of feeling very, very helpless. This is closed and that is closed, and in the United States at least, Baruch Hashem, I don't think it happens so much here, although it probably happened in a few places here. They're closing down shows. They're closing down shows. Like in Chicago, shuls are closed. In Silver Spring, Maryland, my old community, shuls are closed. They're closed. Now, why people have to be more machmir than the government itself, I'm not sure, because there is no government that has prohibited the holding of religious services in groups under 100. Israel is 10. I mean, in the United States, they go from 100 to 500. So anything less than 100 is allowed, and yet the shuls are closing up. And they're making a point. They have a beautiful musar. Somebody found a vort from the Breitowitz that says that just like Chazal say in Maseches Megillah, that all of the shuls are going to uproot themselves and go to Eretz Yisrael, Limosa Mashiach, the Breitowitz says, Kal v'chaimer, a Jewish home that's filled with Kedusha, is also going to get uprooted. It's Kal v'chaimer. So they want to say, it's a nice vort of comfort. Now that you're not able to go to shul, you'll be able to go home and make your home like a Beis HaMikdash that'll be roy for Mashiach. Okay, it's a nice nechama. But still, if shuls are closing down, yeshivas are closing down, schools are closing down, hotels are closing down, every Pesach program in Eretz Yisrael and other places has been canceled. So people are very confused. They're disoriented. But there's something very good about being disoriented, because we realize we are not in control. Now, the truth of the matter is, this hasn't changed anything. We were never in control. But normally we live with comfortable illusions that give us the feeling that we are masters of our fate. And every once in a while, we get a reminder. I mean, normally Hashem lets us live with those illusions because they're comforting, they give us a sense of safety. But when we use it to forget HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then something comes down the road that reminds us, you're not in control, fella. Only Hashem is in control. And then when we internalize the lesson, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can then let things go back to normal, because then you understand who is the source of all of the good things that are happening. Yeah.
Is all this to say that the world may have been in a large state of panic and disillusionment and fear before this happened, and a virus is just kind of an excuse to freak out and to project that panic on?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, listen, I think it may be the opposite way. The world might be complacent. The economy was going so well. I mean, there is, of course, what they call Trump derangement syndrome, but that's a separate that's a separate issue. I don't want to comment on politics. But the world is now certainly in a great state of turbulence, confusion, panic, anxiety. In fact, I focus on that much more than the disease itself. The panic is really unprecedented. It's really, I don't want to say unprecedented in human history. That's probably not the case. But in recent years, certainly, I don't remember a situation, even in time of war. I mean, Israel has been through wars, right? Quite a few wars. But for some reason, this is where the anxiety here is worse than it was even during the Gulf War and all the other wars that the state of Israel has been in. But I think what that means is we need the reminder more. We need this reminder. And this paves the way for Mashiach. This really does pave the way. And I'm not going to be those people that tell you from the gematria of Corona, whatever it is. I don't want to go into that type of overly specific messianic prediction, because most of them turn out to be false. But the idea that Hashem is preparing the world for Geula is pretty clear. Whether it'll be tomorrow, next year, or 2 years, or 5 years, I don't know. I'm not going to say. But this is preparing us for Geula, because the first step to prepare for Geula is to know Ein Od Milvado. There is nothing, there is no power but HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And one of the ways we sometimes need to learn that is by knowing how powerless and helpless we are. And then we know Ein Od Milvado. And Be'ezras Hashem, Ein Od Milvado is the opening, the precursor, the Pesach for a Geula Shlema. Yeah.
Have you seen any indications that the general population at large that believes their life is just a function of luck and that everything is under their control and that it's, hevel, too bad that right now we're out of control, but still not, have you seen any indications that basically Rabbi Wiener was telling us that it's us, this is really for us.
Yeah.
Because we're the ones who can hear the music. The rest of them, something like this happens, they're not going to wake up anyway.
To some degree that's true. I mean, listen, it does say Rishayim do not do tshuva even at the entrance of Gehenna, right? They're going into Gehenna, they see this furnace, whatever that would mean, and they're still defiant. So you're right, some people don't change no matter what. On the other hand, these types of events can have an impact. The 6-Day War was a good example. 6-Day War, where really the state of Israel was initially in tremendous danger, and then there was a miraculous victory getting Yerushalayim back and the Kotel back, and just 6 days vanquishing all of these powerful armies. That had a powerful impact on people. People realized that we couldn't have done it alone. This was from Hashem. And really, the start of what's called the Baal Tshuva movement is really around the 6-Day War. That's when Or Sameach started, that's when Eish Torah started, and there was a lot of, massive kiruv. Now, it petered out after a while. That's very true. But one might imagine that this can also be a catalyst for bringing some people. Now, everybody, no. Some people don't listen no matter what. But I think that as people reflect on the panic and on their helplessness and the fact that they're literally like a chicken without a head, reflective people come to certain conclusions. And Be'ezras Hashem, we hope that more and more people will think about it. But of course, Rabbi Wiener is correct. people who are already ma'aminim have to internalize this even more, because
Is
even
it a chiyuv on us during this time to reach out to people from our past life and offer them a more direct path to Torah in a critical time like this?
Listen, it's certainly a proper thing to do, but you have to be sure that you don't do more harm than good. I mean, that's always the problem in reaching out. If one can reach out in a way that a person can accept and can connect to and can identify with, then it's always good. Sometimes it's the other way around. If you come across as judgmental, as opinionated, as know-it-all, then unfortunately that backfires, and that could be a very, very negative thing. So Chazal basically say, this is the famous statement, just as it is a mitzvah to say something that will be accepted, it is a mitzvah not to say something that is not going to be accepted. So one has to know that sometimes you have to be silent. They tell a story, I'll just end here, just about that Maimer Chazal, that there was a fellow in Europe who was a very, very wealthy guy, and he was religious, but he didn't want to give any tzedakah. He didn't want to help anybody. Nobody could get anything from him beyond token donations. So the Rav, who was a chashuv Rav, a great Talmid Chacham, wanted to give him musar. So we asked the person, can you come to my house in the afternoon? And the person had covered for the Rav, so he comes to the Rav's house. And he sits at the Rav's house, at the dining room table, and the Rav does not say anything to him for a half an hour. So the person is getting uncomfortable. He finally says to the Rav, Rebbe, I'm very happy to be here, I'm very honored to be here, but what did you want to talk to me about? The Rav said, I wanted to fulfill a mitzvah with you. Our city has many, many poor people, and I know you never give. And Chazal say, just as it's a mitzvah to say something that will be listened to, it's a mitzvah not to say something that will not be listened to. And I know that you never listen, so I wanted to fulfill the mitzvah of not saying anything to you because it's not going to be listened to. So I've done my mitzvah. So apparently the man took away the Rav's mitzvah because apparently that he got the point, and then he gave the tzedakah. So silence can sometimes be more effective than even the speech itself. So again, I don't know if people are leaving the country or not planning on leaving the country. If you have a choice, I would recommend personally that it's better to stay at this point, because if you stay, you will be able to leave later if you need to leave later. But if you leave, you might not be able to get back later in time for the Zman and whatever it would be. So I know that being away from family, if you were planning on doing that, it can be, it's painful. And if you have to go, you have to go. You don't have a choice. But if no one asked my opinion, so I don't know why I'm giving it. But it would seem that being in Eretz Yisrael during this time is a good thing, both because it's Pesach is a good thing, and Bichlal, this is a place where Hashem's hashgacha and protection is stronger. And of course the learning of Torah is a great, great segula. And even if yeshivas cannot operate at full capacity, I'm glad that we're having a bootlegged Seder and bootleg learning. The more learning we can do, the greater zechuyos you're bringing for yourself and your family and for Klal Yisrael. So I hope that B'Yasser Hashem, you'll continue this as long as you're able to continue it. Anyway, be healthy, and Hashem should bring all of Klal Yisrael and all of the world a refuah min hashamayim.